Welcome to Viking Law School. Without the school part, if you picture Vikings, chances are you imagine big guys with axes, long ships with dragon heads, and maybe some loud drinking in smoky halls. What you probably don't imagine is paperwork. Well, to be fair, they didn't actually have much paperwork, but the Vikings did have laws, and not just a few rules scribbled on a rock somewhere. They had entire systems of justice. You might say that behind the chaos of raiding and pillaging, there was actually quite a lot of order. Strange order, sure, but order all the same. So, let's step into Viking Law School. Don't worry, there are no exams, no heavy textbooks, and no crushing student debt. Just a field full of people shouting at each other, some memorized rules, and maybe a goat wandering through the crowd. Welcome to the Viking way of justice. Why Vikings needed laws now? You might wonder, why did people who loved raiding and fighting even bother with laws? It's a fair question. But here is the thing, Vikings were not just warriors. In fact, most of them were farmers, traders, and neighbors. They grew crops, raised sheep, and tried to make it through long, cold winters without freezing or starving. You can't really live in a society where everyone just does whatever they want, at least not for long. If you stole your neighbor's cow, that wasn't just bad manners, it was survival on the line. And if you killed someone in a drunken brawl, it wasn't only between you and the victim. Whole families might rise up for revenge, and suddenly you had a full-blown feud on your hands. So laws were there to keep the peace. They didn't stop violence completely, but they gave people a system to deal with it, one that was better than endless revenge. What laws looked like, forget giant law books or dusty scrolls. Viking laws lived inside people's heads. They had a special person, called a law speaker, whose job was to remember all the rules and recite them at big gatherings. Imagine trying to keep thousands of laws straight in your memory without Google, without notes, and without coffee. That's what a law speaker had to do. Every year, at a big outdoor assembly called the Thing, the law speaker would stand up and say out loud all the laws of the land piece by piece, section by section, so everyone could hear and remember. If you forgot a part, too bad. The law lived in the community's memory, not on paper, and in some ways, that made it flexible. If people agreed something was a law, then it was a law. If they decided to change it, the spoken word made it official. The Thing, Viking court in a field. So what was the Thing exactly? Picture this, a huge open-air meeting, with free men from across the region gathering in one spot. No fancy courthouses, no judges in black robes, no jury boxes, just a crowd of farmers, warriors, and chieftains standing around in the grass, debating cases, hearing laws, and settling disputes. The Thing wasn't only about law, though. It was also a big social event. People traded goods, swapped gossip, arranged marriages, and maybe even found out which neighbor's sheep had wandered into whose pasture. It was politics, business, and family drama all rolled into one, and the rules of the Thing were clear. Everyone got their say, and disputes had to be settled, whether with money, oaths, or sometimes good old-fashioned shouting matches. It was democracy, Viking style, messy, loud, but surprisingly effective. Laws that sound strange to us. Some of these Viking laws sound reasonable even today. Don't steal. Don't murder without consequences. Don't destroy someone else's property. But then you get to the stranger ones. For example, calling someone a liar in public could land you in just as much trouble as actual theft. Why? Because honor was everything. Words could damage a person's reputation, and reputation was as valuable as gold. Or take the rules about feuds. Killing wasn't exactly illegal, it just came with a price tag. If you murdered someone, you could pay wergild, or man price, to the victim's family. The amount depended on the person's social status. A farmer had one price, a slave another, a noble an even higher one. It sounds bizarre, but it was actually a way to stop revenge cycles from spiraling out of control. Keeping order without cops here is another strange thing. The Vikings had no police. No one was walking around in a helmet saying, "You're under arrest." Instead, it was up to families and communities to enforce the law. If you were fined, your family had to make sure you paid. If you were outlawed, banished from society, it was up to everyone else to enforce that. Outlawry, by the way, was the worst punishment of all. If you were declared an outlaw, it meant you were literally outside the law. Anyone could kill you without penalty. You had no rights, no protection, nothing. Basically, you were erased from society. Talk about a terrifying way to keep people in line. Why it worked so? How did all of this work without police, without prisons, without written laws? Surprisingly well. Viking societies weren't perfect, but their laws managed to keep order in communities that might otherwise have fallen apart. The thing gave people a voice. The law speaker gave people memory, and the strange but flexible rules gave people a way to survive together in a harsh world. In many ways, Viking law was less about punishment and more about balance. If something went wrong, whether it was a stolen sheep or a murdered brother, the law was there to restore harmony, to make sure life could go on, without everything collapsing into endless revenge. Setting the stage, so here, we are at the start of our Viking law journey. A world without paperwork, without police, without courts, but not without rules. The laws the Vikings followed were sometimes harsh, sometimes strange, and sometimes surprisingly fair. And as we'll see in the next chapters, they covered just about everything: marriage, property, feuds, animals, and even insults. For now, remember this: behind the beards, the swords, and the longships, the Vikings were also people who wanted peace, order, and maybe a little predictability in their unpredictable lives. Their laws were the backbone of their society. Strange, yes, but also clever in their own Viking way. So grab your blanket, get cozy, and let's keep exploring the world of Viking law, starting with the Thing itself, where all the magic, or at least the legal shouting, happened. The Thing, Viking court in a field. Imagine if your local courthouse wasn't a building at all, but just a big open meadow. No walls, no judges' benches, no air conditioning, not even a roof, just a field. That's basically what Viking justice looked like. Welcome to the Thing, the heart of Viking law, and one of the strangest but most fascinating institutions in the medieval world. What was the Thing? The Thing wasn't just one event, it was a system. Every region had its own thing, sort of like a local court and parliament rolled into one. If you lived in Iceland, Norway, or Denmark, you knew exactly when and where your thing would take place. And if you were a free man, you were expected to show up. Picture it: farmers in rough wool tunics, warriors with axes hanging from their belts, chieftains with flashy cloaks, and maybe a wandering merchant or two, all gathering in a big open space. Add a few sheep wandering through the crowd for atmosphere, and you've got yourself a Viking parliament. A court, a parliament, a festival. The Thing wasn't just about laws, it was also about life. Think of it as part courthouse, part farmer's market, and part family reunion, if your family reunion also came with the risk of a blood feud. At the Thing, people came to settle disputes, property arguments, inheritance fights, and the occasional "your cow ate my grass" complaint. But it was also the perfect place to do business. Merchants brought goods to trade, families arranged marriages, and gossip spread like wildfire. If you wanted to know who was feuding with whom, or who just divorced whom, the Thing was the place to be. Who ran the Thing? The real star of the show was the law speaker. This person wasn't a judge, but more like the living hard drive of Viking law. His job was to memorize all the laws and recite them during the Thing. Not once, not twice, but in chunks every year, so the entire law was refreshed by memory over 3 summers. It sounds impressive, and it was. Imagine being able to stand up in front of hundreds of people and rattle off exact legal rules about sheep theft, inheritance rights, and blood money without a single note card. Forget lawyers in suits. The Vikings had one guy with a really good memory, and the law speaker wasn't alone. Chieftains, landowners, and respected men of the community all had a say. It wasn't a democracy in the modern sense. Women and slaves weren't voting, for example, but compared to many parts of medieval Europe, it was remarkably open. How cases were heard: let's say you had a problem. Maybe your neighbor accused you of moving his boundary stone to steal a strip of land. Or maybe someone had killed your cousin in a brawl. What did you do? You brought it to the Thing. At the Thing, everyone gathered around while the case was argued. There were no lawyers, each man represented himself or had family members argue on his behalf. Witnesses were called, oaths were sworn, and sometimes tempers flared. In the end, the assembly decided on fines, settlements, or if things were really bad, outlawry. It wasn't always neat or tidy. Imagine dozens of people yelling their side of the story while goats bleated in the background. But somehow, out of all the noise, decisions got made. The social side now. Don't picture the Thing as purely grim business. It was also a big social event. People traveled long distances to attend, so they made the most of it. Families camped out, merchants sold food and goods, and there were plenty of feasts. Think of it like a medieval county fair, except with more axe fights and fewer Ferris wheels. You might go to settle a lawsuit, but you'd also leave with new gossip, maybe some imported goods, and possibly even a marriage deal for your daughter. Iceland's famous Thing. Out of all the Viking lands, Iceland took the Thing to another level. They had the Althing, a massive gathering held every summer at a place called Thingvellir. Thousands of people showed up, turning the valley into a temporary city of tents and stalls. It wasn't just locals either. People came from all across the island, making it a true national assembly. Here, laws were made, disputes settled, and political alliances formed. The Althing still exists today in Iceland, making it one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. Not bad for something that started with a few farmers standing in a field. Why the Thing worked? The Thing worked because it wasn't just about punishment. It was about participation. Everyone who mattered had a voice, and decisions were made in public, with the whole community watching. That kind of openness gave the system legitimacy. If you lost your case, you couldn't complain that it was rigged in secret. Everyone saw the process. And if you won, well, you had the weight of the whole assembly behind you. Even in a society with no police, that carried a lot of power. The Thing is balance more than anything. The Thing was about balance. Viking society was full of strong personalities, chieftains, warriors, farmers, all trying to protect their honor. Without some kind of system, everything could spiral into chaos. The Thing provided that balance. It gave people a place to vent, to argue, and to settle disputes without resorting to endless feuds. Sure, fights still broke out, but at least there was a structure to channel the conflict. Wrapping up, so, the next time you picture Vikings, don't just imagine raids and battles. Picture them standing in a grassy field, arguing about sheep and property lines, while a law speaker recited laws from memory. Stranger, yes, but it worked. The Thing was where Viking society came together, where order was hammered out in the middle of chaos. It was messy, loud, and occasionally violent, but it kept the wheels of Viking life turning. And now that we've seen how the Thing worked, it's time to look at one of the strangest parts of Viking law, how they handled murder, feuds, and the price of a life itself. Because in Viking society, even killing someone could be settled with the right amount of silver. Family feuds and blood money. If you've ever seen a Viking movie, you know they loved a good fight. But here is the twist. Fighting wasn't always against the law. In fact, in Viking society, sometimes killing someone wasn't considered illegal at all as long as you paid for it afterward. That's right. Murder could be solved with a checkbook. Well, not literally a checkbook, more like silver coins, cattle, or goods. Welcome to the world of wergild, also known as man price. The price of a person. Wergild was the fine you paid for killing someone. It was basically saying, oops, sorry I axed your cousin. Here is some silver to make it better. The amount depended on who the victim was. A regular free farmer had one price, a noble had a much higher one, and slaves sadly were often valued like property. To us, this sounds bizarre. How can you put a price on a human life? But for the Vikings, it was practical. Without it, a killing could spiral into endless revenge. One family would kill in return, then the other family would strike back, and before long the whole valley was at war. Wergild was a way to stop the cycle. Pay up, shake hands, and hopefully move on. Feuds, the family business of course. It didn't always work. Feuds were still a big part of Viking life. If you thought family reunions today could be tense, imagine showing up and knowing half your cousins are sworn enemies with the other half. Feuds could last 4 years, sometimes generations. They weren't just about revenge, they were about honor. If someone wronged your family and you didn't strike back, people would say you were weak. And in a society where reputation was everything, that was a disaster. But there was a balance. Too much revenge could destroy your family, just as much as doing nothing. That's where the law came in, trying to manage the delicate dance between justice and peace. Strange cases of compensation. Not all wergild cases were about murder. Sometimes they involved injury. If you injured someone in a fight, you could end up paying for things like lost work days or even tooth damage. Yes, there were actual fines for knocking out someone's teeth. Property also came into it. If you killed someone's slave, you owed compensation. If your sheep trampled your neighbor's crops, guess what you had to pay up? The law had a price tag for almost everything, and some of the examples from the sagas are downright strange. There are stories of disputes over accidentally killing a sheepdog, or arguments about whether someone's injury was worth half a fine or a full fine. Imagine standing in front of a crowd of Vikings while everyone debated whether your black eye was worth 10 silver coins or 20. Wergild in action. So how did this actually play out? Let's say you killed someone in a drunken brawl. Their family would take you to the thing. The law speaker would recite the rules. Witnesses would speak, and the assembly would decide how much you owed. Then came the tricky part, payment. You couldn't just pull out a wallet and swipe your Viking debit card. You had to gather the silver, livestock, or goods to cover the fine. Sometimes the payment came in installments, stretched out over years. And if you couldn't pay, well, that's when things got dangerous. Failing to pay your wergild could lead to outlawry. That meant no protection from the law, no rights, and the possibility that the victim's family or anyone else really could kill you on sight. Suddenly, finding that silver seemed like a very good idea. When revenge trumped law, of course, not every family was satisfied with wergild. Some thought no amount of silver could make up for a lost son or brother. And in those cases, feuds broke out anyway. The Icelandic sagas are full of these stories. One man kills another, offers wergild, but the family refuses. They want blood, not silver. The feud escalates, more people die, and suddenly half the community is drawn into the conflict. In the end, sometimes the only solution was exile or outlawry, removing the troublemaker entirely from society. A practical but strange system from a modern perspective. Wergild feels cold. How can money make up for a life? But in Viking society, it was better than the alternative. Without it, every murder could trigger endless bloodshed. With it, at least there was a chance for peace. And in a way, it showed how much the Vikings valued community. They weren't trying to create perfect justice, they were trying to keep society functioning. If people kept killing each other without resolution, no one would survive the winter. Wergild was a compromise, not perfect, but practical. Beyond murder, the idea of paying fines for wrongdoing went beyond violence. Vikings also had fines for theft, for damaging property, even for insults. That's right, call someone the wrong name, and you might find yourself paying a fine. It seems ridiculous, but in a culture where honor mattered so much, words could be as damaging as weapons. So in a way, wergild wasn't just about murder. It was part of a bigger system of balance, restoring harmony whenever something went wrong, whether it was spilled blood or spilled ale. Wrapping up, so, the next time you hear that Vikings were just violent raiders, remember this: they also had one of the strangest but cleverest systems for dealing with conflict. Kill someone, pay the fine, start a feud, settle it with silver. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't always work, but it gave Viking society a way to keep moving forward. Even in the face of violence, honor was defended, peace was sometimes restored, and life went on. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happened when wergild wasn't enough, when the punishment wasn't just a fine, but complete banishment. Because if you thought paying silver was bad, wait until you hear about becoming an outlaw. Outlaws, the worst punishment of all. If you think modern punishments, like prison or community service, sound tough, just wait until you hear about the Viking version. Because in Viking society, there was one penalty that everyone feared above all else: being declared an outlaw. Now, when you hear the word outlaw, you might picture a cowboy with a wanted poster in the Wild West. But in Viking times, being an outlaw was way worse. It didn't just mean war outside the law, it meant you were outside society itself. You were basically erased as a person. What did it mean to be an outlaw? When the thing declared someone an outlaw, they were stripped of all legal protection. That meant if anyone killed you, they wouldn't be punished for it. In fact, sometimes they might even be rewarded. You couldn't live among your people anymore. You couldn't go to the market, trade, or farm your land. You couldn't call on your family for help in disputes. You weren't just a criminal, you were a non-person. For a Viking, this was terrifying. Remember, survival depended on community. Winters were brutal, farming was hard, and protection from raids was essential. Being cast out meant you were almost certainly doomed. Two kinds of outlawry. There were actually two levels of outlawry. Lesser outlawry. This lasted 3 years. During that time, you had to leave the community and couldn't come back until your sentence was over. If you managed to survive in exile, you could eventually return and reclaim your place. Full outlawry. This was the ultimate punishment. If you were declared a full outlaw, there was no coming back. You were permanently banished, and anyone could kill you on sight without consequence. Your property was often confiscated, and your name was blackened forever. So yeah, not exactly a slap on the wrist. What could get you outlawed? The reasons for outlawry varied, but they all boiled down to serious crimes or dishonorable behavior. Murder without paying wergild was a common one. If you killed someone and refused to make amends, outlawry was the next step. Repeated theft or arson could also land you outside the law, and sometimes even insults, if bad enough, could escalate into outlawry, especially if they sparked feuds. Basically, if you were too disruptive for society to handle, they didn't lock you up. They just pushed you out and said, "Good luck surviving on your own." Life as an outlaw. So what did you do if you were outlawed? Well, your options weren't great. You could try to hide in the wilderness, living off the land like some kind of medieval survivalist. You could try to flee to another region or even another country. The word of your outlawry might follow you. Or you could take the most dangerous path of all, living as a bandit, raiding and stealing to survive. The sagas are full of stories about outlaws living in caves or forests, always on the run, never safe. They became larger-than-life figures, part villain, part folk hero. Some were admired for defying the odds, while others were hunted down quickly. Famous outlaws. One of the most famous was Grettir the Strong, a legendary outlaw from Iceland. According to his saga, he was incredibly powerful, but also unlucky. He was outlawed for killing and spent nearly 20 years on the run, hiding in caves, raiding farms, and constantly looking over his shoulder. Eventually, he was hunted down and killed, but not before becoming a folk legend. Stories like Grettir's show how outlawry captured the imagination. It was both terrifying and thrilling, the idea of living outside the rules, free but doomed. Why outlawry worked at first? Outlawry might sound like an easy punishment. No prison, no chains, just go live in the woods. But in Viking times, that was a death sentence for most people. Remember, this was a world without supermarkets, heaters, or cozy cabins. Surviving alone was nearly impossible. And even if you managed to scrape by, you were always at risk of being hunted down by those who wanted revenge, or just someone looking for glory. So outlawry worked because it cut people off from the one thing they couldn't live without: community. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about removing danger from society and making sure everyone else could live in peace. The social death. Some historians call outlawry a kind of social death. You weren't just banished physically, you were erased from memory. Your property was taken, your name disgraced, your ties to family severed. And in a world where honor and reputation meant everything, that was worse than death itself. You could fight bravely and die in battle with songs sung about you, But if you were outlawed, you were remembered only as a disgrace. Outlawry versus prison. It's interesting to compare this with other medieval societies. In much of Europe, punishments involved prison, torture, or execution. The Vikings, on the other hand, rarely used prisons at all. Outlawry was their way of dealing with serious crime without building dungeons, and in some ways, it was more efficient. Instead of keeping criminals locked up and feeding them, they simply kicked them out. Problem solved for everyone except the outlaw. Wrapping up, so there you have it, outlawry. The Viking punishment that was worse than death. It turned criminals into ghosts, erased from society, left to fend for themselves in a brutal world. It's strange, but also clever. The Vikings didn't waste resources on prisons. They didn't always rely on executions. Instead, they used the power of community itself as the greatest punishment. If you couldn't live by the rules, you couldn't live among the people. In the next chapter, we'll leave behind murder and exile for something a little more domestic: love, marriage, and divorce. Because Viking laws weren't just about blood and feuds, they also had some surprisingly detailed rules about how couples tied the knot, and even how they split apart. Marriage, divorce, and Viking love rules. When you picture Viking romance, you might imagine a burly warrior sweeping a woman off her feet and carrying her away on a longship. Dramatic, yes, but the reality was a lot less like a movie and a lot more like a business deal. Love was nice, sure, but marriage in Viking society was first and foremost about family alliances, property, and honor. And yes, there were rules, lots of rules. Marriage wasn't just about love to the Vikings. Marriage was serious business. It wasn't only about two people, it was about two families. A wedding could unite clans, strengthen political ties, and secure land or wealth. Parents often arranged the match, and negotiations could drag on for a while. If you were a Viking man, you didn't just run off and marry whoever you fancied. Your family had to approve, and so did hers. And if you were a Viking woman, you had more say than you might expect for the time. Women couldn't usually choose a husband on their own, but they could reject one. If she really didn't want to marry a certain man, her opinion carried weight. Bride price and dowry. Here is where things get a bit transactional. In Viking law, marriage involved two key payments: bride price munda. This was money or property paid by the groom's family to the bride's family. It wasn't buying a wife, despite sounding a bit like it. Instead, it was a way of showing that the groom could support her. Dowry Heimenfilgia. This was property that the bride brought into the marriage from her family. Think of it as her financial security blanket. If the marriage ended, the dowry usually went back to her. So really, marriage was a legal contract with assets exchanged, protections in place, and the community watching. Romantic? Not exactly. Practical? Absolutely. The wedding ceremony. Viking weddings were big deals. They often lasted several days, with feasting, drinking, and plenty of storytelling. But the ceremony itself wasn't just about fun, it was a legal event. The most important part was the exchange of vows and the formal agreement of the families. The groom swore to protect and provide, the bride swore loyalty, and the families swore to honor the deal. Witnesses were crucial, because marriage wasn't just personal, it was a public contract. And of course, no Viking wedding was complete without a feast. Huge amounts of ale, mead, and roasted meat were consumed. Guests celebrated loudly, because a strong wedding feast symbolized a strong union. Rules about fidelity now. Here is where Viking laws get uneven. Men were allowed a certain amount of leeway when it came to mistresses or casual affairs. Women, on the other hand, were held to stricter standards. If a wife cheated, it was considered a serious offense that could ruin her honor and her family's reputation. But it wasn't all one-sided. Husbands who humiliated their wives, say, by bringing home a mistress and flaunting it, could also face shame or even legal trouble. Viking society valued balance. Even if the scales weren't totally equal, there were still rules to keep things from getting out of hand. Divorce. Easier than you'd think. Here is the surprising part. Viking women could divorce their husbands. That's right. Long before many parts of Europe allowed it, Viking women had the right to walk away from a marriage. The laws varied depending on region, but common reasons included if the husband failed to provide for her, if he was violent or abusive, if he failed to perform his marital duties. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. To start a divorce, a woman didn't need a lawyer or a courtroom. Sometimes, she just had to announce it in front of witnesses at the house or at the thing. Once the words were spoken, the marriage was legally over, and when a divorce happened, property was divided. The dowry went back to the woman, along with any other agreements made at the start. So while divorce wasn't necessarily easy emotionally, it was legally straightforward. Inheritance and children marriage also tied closely into laws about inheritance. Children from a marriage were legitimate heirs, which meant they could inherit land, property, and wealth. That's why making sure a marriage was legal and witnessed was so important. It protected the children's rights. Illegitimate children didn't always get the same inheritance, though sometimes they were recognized if the father admitted them. Again, reputation and honor shaped the rules. Families didn't want disputes later on about who got what. Strange marriage stories. The sagas are full of strange stories about Viking marriages and divorces. In one tale, a woman divorced her husband because he wore low-cut shirts and exposed his chest too much, which she said made him look unmanly. Harsh, but apparently legal. Another saga tells of a bride who rejected her groom on the wedding day because he showed cowardice in a fight. She claimed she couldn't respect a man who lacked courage, and the marriage was called off. Imagine explaining that one to the guests after the feast was already cooked. Why these rules mattered. So why did the Vikings care so much about marriage laws? Simple: stability. Families were the backbone of Viking society. Marriages weren't just about romance, they were about alliances, property, and survival. Clear rules about marriage and divorce kept families from feuding endlessly. They made sure property stayed in the right hands, children had secure inheritances, and society kept running smoothly. In a harsh world, you needed strong family bonds. Wrapping up, so while Hollywood might show Viking love as wild passion on stormy seas, the truth is a little more down to earth. Marriage was a contract. Divorce was possible. Love was nice, but honor, property, and survival mattered more. And in some ways, Viking marriage laws were surprisingly progressive. Women had rights, contracts protected both sides, and divorce gave people a way out. Not exactly the free-for-all you might expect from people known for swinging axes. In the next chapter, we'll move from romance to real estate. Because if you think marriage contracts were complicated, wait until you hear about the laws surrounding Viking land and property. Turns out, moving a boundary stone was practically a crime of the century. Property and land laws. When you think of Vikings, you probably imagine longships crashing onto foreign shores, warriors charging into battle, and treasure chests of shiny silver. What you probably don't picture is a bunch of farmers arguing about whose fence post is 2 feet too far into someone else's pasture. But here is the thing, most Vikings spent way more time farming than raiding, and that meant land. Who owned it, who inherited it, and where the boundaries were was one of the most important parts of Viking law. Land was life in Viking society. Land wasn't just property. It was survival. Your farm fed your family, supported your animals, and gave you a place to build your hall. Without land, you were nothing. Owning land meant you had a voice at the thing. It gave you status, security, and power. That's why property disputes could get just as heated as family feuds. In fact, sometimes they were the same thing. A cousin moves a boundary stone. Congratulations, you've got yourself a feud. Boundary stones and big problems. One of the most serious property crimes in Viking law was moving a boundary stone. That might not sound like a big deal today, but back then, it was almost as bad as theft. Those stones marked the edges of farms, and moving one even a little bit was basically stealing land. And land was priceless. A small strip of pasture could mean the difference between having enough hay for your cattle or losing half your herd in winter. So if someone messed with your boundary, You weren't just annoyed, you were ready to take them to the thing. Or maybe to the battlefield. Inheritance rules, land ownership, also connected to inheritance. Viking law was pretty detailed about who got what when someone died. Sons usually inherited first, but daughters weren't excluded. Women could inherit property, though sometimes their share was smaller. The goal was to keep land within the family. No one wanted property chopped up into useless little strips or sold off to outsiders. That's why marriages, dowries, and inheritances were often tied together in complex webs of agreements. And if there was no clear heir, well, that's when trouble started. Whole sagas revolve around inheritance disputes, with cousins, nephews, and distant relatives all claiming the same piece of land. Buying and selling land could be bought or sold, but not casually. Transactions had to be witnessed and approved at the thing to make them legally binding. You couldn't just shake hands in private and call it done. The community had to see it, to make sure no one cheated later. Payment didn't always mean silver, either. Sometimes land was exchanged for livestock, weapons, or other valuable goods. The key was that everyone knew the deal had been made, and the witnesses could vouch for it. Disputes over farms, because farming was so central to Viking life. Disputes about land and animals were common. Did your neighbor's sheep wander into your fields? Did someone's cow eat your hay? Was that stream dividing your land or his? All of these questions could end up in front of the thing. Some of these cases sound small, but they mattered. A single lost sheep or trampled field could be a big hit to a family's survival. And when people are desperate, even small disputes can turn ugly fast. Odd rules about moving houses here is a strange one. In some regions, if a farmer literally picked up his house and moved it onto someone else's land, he could claim that land as his own. It sounds ridiculous, but it was tied to the idea that land was defined by where you lived and built. If you shifted your home, you shifted your claim. Of course, this wasn't easy. Moving a Viking longhouse was no small feat, but the fact that the law even mentioned it shows how seriously they took the link between houses and land. Property and honor. Land disputes weren't just about survival, they were also about honor. Owning land showed you were a person of worth. Losing land, whether through trickery, inheritance battles, or outright theft, was a blow to your reputation. That's why some of the fiercest battles in sagas aren't about treasure from raids, but about farmland. To us, it might look like people fighting over mud and grass. To them, it was the foundation of life itself. Community involvement. What's striking about Viking property law is how public it all was. Everything, from buying land to settling disputes, happened in front of witnesses. There was no private paperwork or shady backroom deals. The community made sure everyone played fair, or at least fair enough. This kept order, but it also meant gossip traveled fast. If you tried to cheat your cousin out of land, everyone would know about it by the end of the thing. And good luck keeping your honor after that. Wrapping up so. While Viking warriors were busy making headlines with their raids, most of the actual drama was happening much closer to home. Land laws kept society grounded literally. They determined who owned what, who inherited what, and who had to pay up when a cow ate someone else's grass. It might not sound as exciting as raiding Paris, but to the Vikings, these laws were just as important. Without clear rules about land, farming communities would collapse, and no one would have the resources to go raiding in the first place. In the next chapter, we'll shift from farms and fields to something a bit warmer, hospitality. Because in Viking law, how you treated your guests wasn't just a matter of manners, it was the law. And insulting a guest could be just as dangerous as stealing a cow. The laws of hospitality. If you've ever had unexpected guests show up at your house, you probably know the panic that comes with it. Do I have snacks? Did I clean the bathroom? Why is there a sock on the living room floor? Now imagine being a Viking. Guests didn't just show up for a quick chat. They could arrive on horseback, with an entourage, in the middle of winter, and expect to be fed, housed, and treated like royalty. And here is the kicker, it wasn't just good manners. In Viking society, hospitality was the law. Guests had rights. Vikings believed in something called Gästrecht. Basically, if someone came to your home, you were legally and socially bound to welcome them. That meant food, drink, and a safe place to sleep. Turning someone away at the door wasn't just rude, it could land you in serious trouble. Guests were protected by law. If harm came to them under your roof, you could be held responsible. Imagine someone getting into a brawl in your living room, and suddenly you're the one paying fines. Not fun. Why hospitality was serious business. This wasn't just about being nice. In a world without hotels or Airbnbs, travelers depended on the kindness of strangers. Roads were long, winters were brutal, and inns were rare. If people didn't take hospitality seriously, travel and trade would have been nearly impossible. On top of that, offering shelter showed off your wealth and status. The bigger the feast you could throw, the more impressive you looked. As stingy host, not only dishonorable, but also legally questionable. Feasting laws. Speaking of feasts, Viking hospitality often meant pulling out all the stops. Guests expected meat, bread, ale, and maybe some entertainment. Drinking together wasn't just for fun, it was an important social ritual. And yes, there were even rules about drinking. For example, refusing to share ale with a guest could damage your reputation and even be grounds for legal complaints. On the flip side, if you drank too much and picked a fight with your host, well, that could get you in trouble too. The law liked balance. Be generous, but don't let things turn into a disaster. Insulting a guest. Insults were a big deal in Viking law, as we'll see more in the next chapter. But insulting a guest was especially serious. Guests were under your protection. If you mocked, threatened, or dishonored them, you weren't just being rude, you were breaking the sacred rules of hospitality. One saga tells of a guest being called out for eating too much at a feast. That might sound like just a bit of teasing, but in Viking culture, it was nearly scandalous. The guest had the right to take offense, and the insult could lead to a feud or legal case. So, hosts had to be careful with their words. The flip side, guests behaving badly. Of course, the laws went both ways. Guests had responsibilities too. They couldn't abuse their host's generosity. Showing up and acting like you owned the place, stealing food, or overstaying your welcome could all lead to serious trouble. In fact, there were rules about how long a guest could reasonably stay. Hospitality didn't mean moving in forever. After a set period, often 3 nights, guests were expected to move along, unless other arrangements were made. So, no Viking was stuck with freeloaders for life. Hospitality as politics. Hospitality wasn't just about survival, it was also about politics. Feasts and visits were chances to build alliances, arrange marriages, and make deals. Sharing food and drink created bonds stronger than words alone. That's why laws protected these gatherings. If someone attacked guests at a feast, it wasn't just violence, it was a violation of trust, and it could bring down heavy legal consequences. Imagine trying to seal a trade deal while worrying that someone might flip the table and start a fight. The law was there to keep things civil mostly. Guests of honor. Not all guests were equal. High-status visitors, chieftains, poets, or important traders were treated with extra care. Hosting someone important could boost your reputation, but it also meant higher stakes if something went wrong. That's probably why some sagas go into so much detail about feasts. They weren't just dinner parties, they were major legal and social events where reputations were on the line. Sacred protection. There was also a spiritual side to hospitality. Norse mythology is full of stories where gods, especially Odin, show up disguised as wanderers. The idea was that anyone knocking on your door could be more than they seemed. Turning away a stranger might mean offending a god, definitely not worth the risk. So, hospitality wasn't only law and custom, it had a touch of divine fear mixed in. Be kind to guests, because you never knew who was really sitting by your fire. Wrapping up, Viking laws of hospitality show just how seriously they took community, survival, and honor. Welcoming a guest wasn't optional, it was a legal, social, and even spiritual duty. Sure, some guests might eat too much, drink too much, or tell the same saga 3 times in a row, but the law said you still had to treat them well. After all, one day, You might be the traveler knocking on a stranger's door, hoping for a warm meal and a safe night's sleep. So, in the Viking world, hospitality wasn't just good manners, it was the glue that held society together. And if you failed at it, the thing might come knocking instead. Next up, we'll look at another strange legal obsession: insults. Because in Viking law, calling someone the wrong name could be just as dangerous as stealing their land. Viking honor and insults. If you've ever been in an argument online, you probably know how quickly it can spiral out of control. Someone calls you a name, you fire back, and suddenly it's a full-blown feud over nothing. Now, imagine that same energy except instead of being online, it's face-to-face, in a Viking hall, with ale, axes, and legal consequences. Because in Viking society, honor was everything, and if someone insulted you, it wasn't just about hurt feelings. It could become a matter of law, reputation, and sometimes blood. Why honor mattered so much in the Viking world? Your reputation was basically your social credit score. No police, no security cameras, just your word, your strength, and what people thought of you. If you had honor, people trusted you. They'd trade with you, fight alongside you, or give your daughter in marriage. Lose your honor, though, and you were in trouble. People might stop respecting you. Worse, they might think they could push you around. So, guarding your reputation was as important as guarding your sheep or your sword. Insults as legal offenses. Here is where it gets interesting. Words could be crimes. In Viking law, certain insults were considered so serious that they could lead to fines, lawsuits, or even duels. For example, calling a man unmanly was one of the worst things you could say. It wasn't just playground teasing, it was a direct attack on his honor. It suggested he was cowardly, weak, or even not fulfilling his role as a man in society. Accusing someone of witchcraft or slavery was also dangerous. These weren't just words, they could destroy someone's social standing overnight. And if you couldn't back up your insult with proof, you might find yourself paying dearly. The law of three ridicules. Some sagas mention a kind of 3 strikes rule with insults. If you mocked someone 3 times publicly and they didn't respond, their honor was considered forfeit. That meant anyone could challenge them, and they'd lose face if they didn't fight back. So, silence wasn't golden in this case. Staying quiet while people mocked you could ruin your reputation. You had to defend yourself, whether through clever words, a lawsuit at the thing, or in some cases, a good old-fashioned sword fight. Insults in verse. Vikings loved poetry, and some of their best insults came in rhyme. Skalds. Norse poets were known for weaving cutting remarks into their verses. It was a dangerous art, though. If you composed a satirical poem that damaged someone's reputation, it could be considered a legal offense. One of the most notorious examples is a type of verse called N, which was basically a weaponized insult poem. If you spread an about someone, say, accusing them of cowardice or mocking their masculinity, you could trigger a legal case or a feud. Think of it as the Viking version of a diss track, except with way higher stakes. When words became weapons, the law treated insults as dangerous because, frankly, they often led to violence. A single word could spark a chain of revenge killings that dragged on for years. So, the legal system tried to keep things under control by putting rules around insults. Instead of going straight for the axe, you were supposed to bring your case to the thing. If someone dishonored you, you could sue them. The outcome, usually a fine, though sometimes it led to exile if the insult was extreme enough. But of course, not everyone followed the rules. Many sagas are filled with characters who took matters into their own hands. After all, waiting for legal proceedings didn't have the same dramatic flair storming into someone's hall with a sword. The power of public words. One key detail. Insults had to be public to count legally. If someone whispered an insult behind closed doors, that was just gossip. But if they shouted it at the thing, or sang it in front of a crowd, now it was legally binding. That's why sagas are full of tense moments at feasts or assemblies, where people throw insults across the room. Everyone was watching, so the insult carried weight. It was like being roasted in front of your whole town, except instead of laughing it off, You might have to sue the guy or challenge him to combat. Women and insults. Interestingly, Viking women also played a role in this world of words. They could hurl insults too, often to push their husbands or sons into action. If a man was reluctant to fight, a woman might shame him with cutting words, suggesting he was cowardly. This kind of fighting a battle of insults was a recognized part of Viking culture. And while women weren't usually the ones swinging swords, their words could spark the conflicts that defined sagas. Famous cases from the sagas. One story tells of a man who accused another of being unmanly, claiming he did women's work instead of fighting. The accused man took the case to the thing, and the insulter had to pay compensation. Another tale describes two poets who insulted each other in verse until things escalated into violence. Their witty barbs might have been clever, but the law said you couldn't just trash someone's honor without consequences. Why all this legal fuss over insults? At first, it might sound silly. Why would a society with raids, battles, and blood feuds care so much about name-calling? The answer goes back to survival. In a small, close-knit community, reputation was life. You couldn't just move to another town and start fresh. Everyone knew everyone. If your honor was damaged, your family's future could be ruined. So, the law gave people a way to handle insults without immediately resorting to axes. It wasn't perfect, but it was an attempt to keep the peace in a culture where words were as sharp as swords. Wrapping up for the Vikings, honor wasn't just an abstract idea, it was a kind of social armor, and insults were cracks in that armor. That's why the law treated words so seriously. Today, being called names might just sting for a while. Back then, it could mean lawsuits, exile, or a feud that lasted generations. So next time you hear someone say, "It's just words," remember, in Viking society, words could get you outlawed, killed, or dragged into court. And sometimes, they were more dangerous than weapons. In our next chapter, we'll see what happened when words weren't enough, when disputes had to be settled with trials, by combat and solemn oaths. Because sometimes, the only way to prove you were right was to literally fight for it. Trials by combat and oaths all right. So we've seen how insults could spark feuds and lawsuits. But sometimes words just weren't enough. What if the people absolutely could not agree? One said, "You stole my cow," and the other said, "No, I didn't, you liar." No witnesses, no proof, just two angry Vikings staring each other down. In those moments, Viking law had a very simple solution: let fate decide. Or, depending on how you look at it, let fists, swords, or the gods decide. Enter trials by combat and trials by oath. Trial by combat, fighting for justice. The idea was straightforward. If you thought you were right, you proved it in combat. Whoever won was assumed to be telling the truth. The gods, people believed, wouldn't let a liar triumph in battle. Now, this might sound unfair. After all, being a skilled warrior doesn't necessarily mean you're innocent. But in Viking culture, fighting ability and honor were deeply linked. If you were weak or cowardly, that was seen as a flaw in your character. So, settling disputes with weapons seemed perfectly reasonable to them. The holmgang, one of the most famous forms of combat trial, was the holmgang, literally meaning island walk. It often took place on a small piece of land, marked off, so the fight had boundaries. Sometimes it really was on a little island, which added extra drama. Two men would face each other with swords or axes. They might have rules about how many shields each could use, or how many blows were allowed. The fight continued until one man was unable to go on. And yes, this could absolutely end in death. But in some cases, one fighter might yield before things got fatal. The point was to demonstrate courage, not necessarily to kill. Legalized duels. What's wild is that holmgangs weren't just bar brawls. They were recognized by law. If you challenged someone and they refused, that could damage their honor. Sometimes refusing a duel even meant automatically losing the case. So, it wasn't just about strength, it was about proving you believed in your side of the argument, so strongly you'd risk your life for it. Famous holmgang stories. The sagas are full of holmgangs. In one story, a man accused another of theft. With no way to prove it, they agreed to fight. The supposed thief lost a duel, which meant he was legally guilty, whether or not he actually stole anything. Another tale involves two men fighting over land ownership. After the holmgang, the victor not only kept the land, but also gained massive respect for defending his claim. Of course, this system wasn't perfect. If you were old, sick, or just terrible with weapons, you were at a huge disadvantage. Some laws eventually restricted holmgangs for this reason, replacing them with less bloody alternatives. Trials by oath. Not every Viking wanted to risk getting their head split open. That's where oath swearing came in. Instead of fighting, you could prove your innocence by swearing a solemn oath before the gods and the community. But here is the catch: your oath often had to be backed up by others. These were called oath helpers or compurgators. Basically, you'd gather a group of friends, family, or neighbors to swear alongside you that you were telling the truth. It was like saying, "I swear I didn't do it, and so do these 12 guys standing here nodding." The weight of words swearing falsely was considered extremely dangerous. Remember, this was a society that believed in powerful gods who hated liars. If you swore an oath and you were lying, you risked divine punishment. Misfortune, sickness, or even death could follow. So, while oath swearing might seem like an easy way out compared to fighting, it carried its own risks. People really believed the gods would make liars pay eventually. Oath objects. To make the oath more serious, Vikings swore on sacred objects. The most famous was the ring of the temple, a special piece of gold or silver kept in a holy place. At the thing, people might swear by touching this ring, calling on the gods to witness their words. Sometimes oaths were sworn on weapons, too. Placing your hand on a sword while swearing made the promise binding. And let's be honest, swearing on a giant battle axe probably made people think twice about lying. When oaths went wrong, of course, not everyone played fair. Some sagas mention people stacking the deck by bribing oath helpers. If you could gather enough buddies willing to swear in your favor, you might win a case even if you were guilty. This is part of why holmgangs stayed popular for so long. At least with combat, it was harder to fake. You couldn't bribe a sword swing. Community theater of justice, both trials by combat and trials by oath, had one thing in common: they were public. These weren't private disputes behind closed doors. Everyone gathered to watch. The thing was not just a court, but also entertainment. People came to see justice done and maybe see a duel break out. Imagine court today if every dispute ended with either a dramatic oath or a sword fight. Court TV would have record-breaking ratings. Why they trusted these systems to us? It might sound like madness deciding guilt based on a fight or a few oaths, but in a world without video evidence, forensics, or written contracts, these methods made sense. A fight proved courage and confidence in your claim. An oath called upon the gods themselves as witnesses. Both gave the community a way to move forward, instead of endlessly debating who was telling the truth. Wrapping up trials by combat and oaths might seem extreme, but they were a practical solution in a rough and tumble world. They blended law, religion, and spectacle into one, and while they didn't always deliver perfect justice, they kept disputes from dragging on forever. So, whether you were risking your life in a holmgang or swearing on a sacred ring, the message was clear. In Viking society, justice was about courage, reputation, and faith in the gods. Next time, we'll look at something even stranger: how Vikings dealt with magic and sorcery in the law. Because when someone accused you of witchcraft, the trial wasn't just about honor, it was about survival in a world that feared the supernatural. Laws on magic and sorcery. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture axes, longships, and rowdy feasts. But here is a twist: the Vikings also lived in a world filled with magic. Not Harry Potter-style magic with wands and sparkles, but Old Norse sorcery, dark, mysterious, and a little terrifying. And yes, they actually had laws about it. Because what do you do if your neighbor curses your cattle, or someone claims they can see the future, or a rival uses spells to make you sick? You take them to court, Viking style. Seer, The sorcery everyone feared, the most infamous kind of magic, was called seer, pronounced sort of like saith. It was a mix of fortune-telling, curses, and shape-shifting tricks. Practitioners of seer claimed they could influence battles, control the weather, or even mess with people's minds. Sounds useful, right? But here is the catch. In Viking society, doing seer was seen as, well, kind of shameful, especially for men. Why? Because it was linked to manipulation and deception instead of straightforward, manly combat. Fighting with a sword was honorable. Whispering spells into the wind, that looked sneaky. In fact, a man accused of practicing seer could be branded as unmanly, or even called a serious insult we talked about earlier. Women and magic for women, though, things were different. Female sorceresses, called vulvas, were respected, even feared. A vulva could travel between communities, offering her services. She might predict the outcome of a voyage, bless a harvest, or place protective charms on warriors. Villages often welcomed them with gifts and food, but at the same time, people kept their distance, because having that much power made you a little dangerous to be around. So, while women could practice magic with some respectability, men risked mockery and legal trouble if they did the same. Magic in the law codes. So what did the actual laws say? Several Viking-era law codes mention witchcraft as a crime. If you were caught using harmful magic-like spells that caused illness, death, or destruction, you could face harsh penalties. In some cases, this meant exile, and in others, it could mean execution. The Icelandic law code, GRGS, specifically banned certain kinds of sorcery. Using spells to kill someone or to drive them insane was treated just like murder. The logic was simple. If your magic caused real harm, it counted as a crime. Evidence of witchcraft. But here is the tricky part. How do you prove someone used magic? Unlike stealing a cow or breaking a fence, you couldn't exactly hold up a curse in court. Often, accusations relied on witnesses who claimed they'd seen suspicious behavior. Maybe someone found strange objects buried in a field, or heard muttering at night, or blamed a sudden illness on sorcery. Sometimes, reputation alone was enough. If you were already known as a bit spooky, people were quick to suspect you when something went wrong. Famous witchcraft trials, the sagas, give us glimpses of how seriously Vikings took these accusations. In one story, a woman is accused of cursing a family, and the case ends with her being driven away from the community. In another, a man is accused of using seer to manipulate others, and his reputation is ruined forever. And then there's the famous story of Eric the Red saga, where a vulva is invited to a feast to predict the future during a harsh famine. She performs a ritual with a special staff, sits on a raised platform, and chants spells while everyone watches. People respected her, but at the same time, they knew her powers could be dangerous if turned against them. The blurred line between religion and magic. It's also important to remember that Viking religion and magic overlapped. The gods themselves were said to practice seer. Odin, the chief god, was a master of it. So, if Odin could do it, why was it shameful for men? That's one of those contradictions that societies often have. It wasn't that magic itself was forbidden, it was about who did it and how it was used. If you used magic for the community's good, like predicting the harvest, you might be tolerated. But if you used it for selfish or harmful reasons, the law could come down on you hard. Superstitions and everyday magic. Not all magic was considered criminal, though. Everyday charms and protective spells were common. People carved runes into weapons for luck, or wore amulets for protection. Nobody was going to sue you for engraving Thor's hammer on your axe. The legal issue came when magic was harmful, sneaky, or disruptive to the community. Basically, good luck charms, fine. Cursing your neighbor so his cows give sour milk, not fine. Punishments for sorcery. So, what happened if you were found guilty of witchcraft? The harshest penalty was death, sometimes by burning, other times by execution in more ordinary ways. But more often, sorcerers were punished by outlawry. Being outlawed meant you were literally cast out of society. You lost all legal protection, and anyone could kill you without punishment. This was one of the worst fates in Viking law, because community was everything. Without it, survival was nearly impossible. Magic and fear of the unknown in the end. Viking laws about sorcery tell us something deeper. People were afraid of what they couldn't see or understand. Disease, bad weather, sudden accidents without science to explain them. Magic became the go-to explanation, and law stepped in as a way to control that fear. If someone was blamed for causing chaos through sorcery, punishing them restored balance and reassured the community. Wrapping up, so, magic in Viking society was both fascinating and frightening. Women could wield it with a mix of respect and fear. Men risked shame, as they did the same. And the laws were quick to punish those accused of using sorcery for harm. At its heart, it was about keeping order in a world where the line between natural and supernatural was razor thin. Next time, we'll look at something far more practical, but just as strange, laws about land and property. Because if you thought duels and curses were dramatic, wait until you hear how seriously Vikings took their farms and fences. Laws about land and property. There's one thing the Vikings cared about almost as much as honor. It was land. You can picture it, long ships, raiding, all that glorious looting, but once the fun was over, what really mattered was coming home to a nice stretch of farmland. After all, you can't live off raiding year-round. Someone's got to grow the barley for beer. And because land was so valuable, Viking societies built a whole maze of laws around who owned what, who could inherit, and what happened if your cow wandered into your neighbor's turnip patch. Why land mattered so much for Vikings. Land wasn't just dirt, it was life itself. Good farmland meant food for your family, animals to trade, and a place to pass on to your children. Think of it like owning a gold mine, except instead of shiny metal, your treasure was oats and goats. And unlike treasure just carry away, land stuck around, that made it worth fighting and suing over. Property rights. Who owns what? The rules about property were surprisingly detailed. Land boundaries were carefully marked, sometimes with stones, fences, or even natural landmarks like rivers or big oak trees. If someone tried to move a boundary marker like, say, sliding a stone a little closer to your neighbor's field, that wasn't just sneaky, it was flat out illegal. In some cases, it was treated almost like theft, because technically, it was stealing just a bit more slowly. Fences and farm animals are fences. You'd think something so boring wouldn't cause drama, but in Viking times, it absolutely did. If your cow wandered into someone else's field and munched all their crops, that was your problem, not theirs. Laws were crystal clear. Keep your animals under control. If they damaged another person's land, you had to pay compensation. Imagine some poor farmer chasing his goat out of a neighbor's barley while shouting, "Don't find me, I'll fix the fence." It might sound funny, but the fines could stink. Inheritance rules. One of the biggest sources of land disputes was inheritance. Who got the farm when dad died? The system usually favored male heirs, but women weren't completely cut out. Daughters could inherit if there were no sons, and widows had certain rights to stay on the land. Still, arguments could drag on for years, and sometimes even end in violence. There are stories in the sagas of families breaking apart because of inheritance fights. Think of it like a Viking version of squabbling over grandma's will, but instead of fighting over jewelry, you're fighting over whether you own the cow pasture by the river. Buying and selling land could be bought and sold, but the process wasn't casual. You didn't just shake hands and say, "Congrats, it's yours now." To make it official, land deals often had to be witnessed at the Viking assembly. That way, everyone knew about it, and nobody could come back later and say, "Wait, I didn't sell you that meadow." This public approach cut down on sneaky deals and gave neighbors a chance to object if they thought the sale wasn't fair. Renting land. Not everyone could afford their own farm, so renting land was common. A tenant farmer would work the land and give part of the harvest to the landowner. But laws protected renters too. If a landlord tried to kick someone off the land unfairly, the case could be taken to court. Vikings really liked the idea that even the little guy had some rights, unless, of course, the little guy insulted someone important, then things got dicey. Property and marriage and property went hand in hand. When two families joined through marriage, land often changed hands as part of the deal. Dowries, gifts, and land transfers helped cement alliances. But if the marriage ended, say, through divorce, the laws laid out who got what. And yes, divorce was legal in Viking society. A woman could walk away from her husband if she had good reason, and she was entitled to take her property back with her. So, while Vikings weren't exactly modern feminists, their property laws gave women more rights than in many other medieval societies. Land disputes are the thing, of course. All these rules didn't stop people from fighting about land. Disputes were taken to the Thing, where free men gathered to debate and make rulings. Sometimes cases were settled peacefully, with compensation paid. Other times, things got heated. Picture two families yelling at each other about who really owned that swampy patch of ground nobody even wanted. And yes, occasionally, land disputes escalated into feuds, because nothing says family bonding arguing over potato fields until someone gets stabbed. The role of outlawry in extreme cases, land theft or disputes, could end with outlawry. If someone ignored court rulings or kept encroaching on land, they might be declared an outlaw. And once you were outlawed, you lost your right to own land at all. Pretty effective way to solve a property dispute: kick the guy out and redistribute his farm. Symbolic acts. One fun detail. Sometimes legal acts about land ownership involve symbolic gestures. For example, a person might hand over a piece of turf from the land to symbolize giving it up. It was like a Viking version of signing a contract, but with dirt instead of paperwork. Imagine someone solemnly handing you a clump of grass and saying, "Congratulations, you now own 3 acres of marshland." Wrapping up Viking laws about land and property, it sound a bit dry, but they reveal a lot about how society worked. Land was power. It fed families, built wealth, and secured legacies. And because it was so important, the laws around it were detailed, practical, and sometimes surprisingly fair. At the end of the day, Viking land laws were about one thing: keeping the peace in a world where everyone wanted the best farm by the river. Next time, we'll move from dirt and fences to something even more dramatic: laws on violence and revenge. Because if you thought arguments over goats were intense, wait until we get into blood feuds. Laws on violence and revenge. If you picture Viking society, you probably imagine axes, swords, and the occasional head getting lopped off in a mead hall. And yes, violence was a big part of their world. But here is the twist: Vikings had an entire set of laws to manage violence. That's right, the people famous for raiding, plundering, and starting brawls in taverns actually spent a lot of time making rules about when you could fight, how you could fight, and what happened afterward. Because as it turns out, even warriors need boundaries. Violence wasn't always illegal. First thing to understand, not all violence was considered a crime. Sometimes it was perfectly legal. For example, if someone insulted your honor, say, called you cowardly, or questioned your masculinity, you were pretty much expected to respond with force. Not doing so could damage your reputation. And reputation, in the Viking world, was worth more than gold. But while throwing fists or axes might solve your immediate anger, the law had to step in to stop things from spiraling into never-ending family feuds. Wergild, the price of a life. The cornerstone of Viking violence law was something called wergild, or man price. Basically, every person had a price tag on their head. If you killed someone, you owed their family compensation. The amount varied depending on the person's status. A wealthy chieftain was worth a lot more than, say, a farmhand. And if you killed a thrall, a slave, the payment went to their owner. It sounds harsh, but in practice, it kept endless blood feuds from breaking out. Instead of your family and the other family killing each other for generations, you could settle it with silver. Imagine a medieval insurance policy, but instead of covering your house, it covered your uncle if he got murdered at a feast. Blood feuds, legal revenge. Of course, not everyone was happy with wergild. Some families preferred revenge. In Viking law, blood feuds were actually allowed. If someone killed your brother, you had the legal right to kill them or someone from their family. The trick was making sure your revenge didn't go too far. If you killed more people than the original offense, your family might end up owing wergild. It was like a deadly version of keeping score. And yes, there are sagas full of stories about families stuck in endless cycles of revenge. Someone kills a cousin, someone else kills a nephew, and on until everyone's at the thing arguing about who owes what. Self-defense and accidental violence, not all killings were treated the same. If you killed someone in self-defense, the law was more forgiving. There were also rules about accidents. Say you're chopping wood, your axe head flies off, and it hits someone. Still a crime, but usually punished with a smaller fine. Unless, of course, people thought you did it accidentally on purpose. Weapons laws surprise. Vikings had weapon laws. Yes, the people famous for carrying swords everywhere actually had rules about when you could bring a weapon into certain places. For instance, bringing a sword into the thing was a big no-no. The assembly was meant to be a place of law, not battle. If you showed up armed and ready to fight, people assumed you weren't there for civil discussion. It's kind of like how we say no phones in class, except much more life-threatening. Public versus private killings, another strange detail. Where you committed violence mattered. Killing someone in public was considered worse than killing them in private. Public violence created chaos and fear in the community, so the punishment was harsher. In other words, if you had a grudge, you were better off settling it quietly in a field rather than stabbing someone in the middle of a feast. Not exactly a healthy approach, but hey, it kept dinner parties from getting too messy. Revenge was regulated. One fascinating thing about Viking law is how it tried to regulate revenge. If you wanted to kill someone for a wrong you, there were actually proper procedures. For example, in some cases, you had to announce your intention, like saying, "Hey, I'm about to avenge my cousin." That way, everyone knew it was a legal act, not just random murder. This made revenge almost like a formal duel. Messy, but civilized at least by Viking standards. Outlawry for excessive violence. If someone went overboard, killed without cause, ignored wergild, or caused too much chaos, they could be declared an outlaw. We talked about outlawry earlier, but here it really came into play. An outlaw was cut off from society, with no legal protection. Anyone could kill them without punishment. So, in some cases, outlawry was basically society's way of saying, "You've fought too much. Please leave, permanently." The role of honor at the heart of all this was honor. Viking laws on violence weren't really about stopping people from fighting, they were about keeping fights fair and reputations intact. Killing could be legal if it defended your name. Paying wergild was honorable because it showed you respected the victim's family. Even revenge had rules, because without them, society would collapse into pure chaos. So yes, Vikings were violent, but they weren't lawless. Their whole legal system was designed to manage the bloodshed, not prevent it completely. A bedtime example: picture this. Two men are at a feast. One insults the other, calling him Arga, the worst possible insult in Viking society. Everyone gasps. The insulted man leaps up, grabs his axe, and before you know it, there's blood on the floor. Legally, the killer can claim he was defending his honor, but the victim's family demands wergild. If the killer refuses, the families may start a feud. If the feud gets out of hand, the thing steps in, and if the killer ignores all of it, he's declared an outlaw. It's a lot of drama over one rude word, but that's how much honor mattered. Wrapping up, Viking laws on violence and revenge were strange, but practical. They didn't try to stop fights completely that would have been impossible in a warrior culture. Instead, they focused on managing violence, setting prices, regulating revenge, and keeping honor intact. It was messy, brutal, and complicated, but for the Vikings, it worked. Their world was violent, yes, but it wasn't without rules. Next up, we'll look at something equally fascinating: laws on trade and raiding. Because when you're hauling loot across the sea or arguing over who gets the best share of silver, you'd better believe the Vikings had rules for that too. Laws on trade and raiding. When you think Vikings, you probably picture raiding first. Long ships gliding across the sea, warriors leaping ashore, monks screaming in terror, and treasures being carried away. And yes, raiding was a big part of Viking life. But here is the twist. The same people who love smashing doors down with axes also cared a lot about rules, especially when it came to money and loot. Whether it was trading honestly in a marketplace or dividing stolen treasure, Vikings had laws to make sure things stayed fair. Because even raiders hate being cheated. The Viking economy. Before we dive into raiding, let's start with trade. The Viking world wasn't just about plunder, it was also about business. Vikings sailed everywhere, from the rivers of Russia to the markets of Constantinople, and even as far as Baghdad. They sold furs, walrus ivory, amber, and even slaves. In return, they brought back silver, silk, spices, and fancy weapons. But trading isn't exactly simple when you don't have a universal currency. Vikings mostly used silver by weight. Coins weren't always accepted at face value. You had to weigh them, and sometimes chop them up into pieces. Imagine paying for your groceries today by hacking a coin in half with a knife at the checkout counter. Naturally, this system needed rules. Laws on trade. So what did Viking laws say about trade? First, honesty mattered. If you sold someone a sword and it turned out to be defective, you could be taken to the thing and made to pay compensation. Same if you sold someone a thrall and they turned out to be sick or missing an arm. Second, weights and measures were regulated. Merchants couldn't just fiddle with their scales to make buyers pay more silver. If you got caught cheating, your reputation was ruined, and in Viking society, reputation was everything. It was all about fairness. The Viking world may seem wild, but trade was serious business, and the law made sure nobody got away with being too sneaky. Raiding. Organized chaos. Now, let's talk about raids. To us, raids look like pure chaos, men with axes running around, grabbing everything not nailed down. But in reality, raids were carefully organized, and the spoils were divided according to rules. When a Viking war band set out, everyone who joined had an agreement. Usually, the leader, the chieftain, or warlord got the largest share. After that, the loot was divided among the crew. If someone captured a particularly valuable item, like a gold cross from a monastery, it had to be handed over and divided fairly. Stealing from your own crew was one of the worst crimes. If you pocketed extra loot without sharing, you could be punished harshly, anything from losing your share to being outlawed. Because nothing destroys a raiding crew faster than mistrust. Laws of the sea. Viking ships were like floating communities, and like any community, they needed rules. For example, everyone on the ship had to contribute supplies, food, weapons, or gear. If you didn't pull your weight, you didn't get a share of the loot, and if you abandoned your shipmates during a raid, you could be branded a coward and lose everything. There were even rules about or space. Each man had his place on the bench, and trying to claim a better spot or pushing someone off wasn't just rude. It could lead to fights that the law had to settle later. In short, raiding wasn't just about brute force. It was also about teamwork, contracts, and trust. The right to raid. Another interesting law. Not everyone could just grab a ship and raid wherever they liked. In some regions, you needed the approval of your local assembly or chieftain. Raiding was technically seen as an extension of warfare, and warfare had rules. Going rogue could make you an outlaw. So while the stereotype of wild Viking raiders is partly true, in reality, raids were often sanctioned and controlled. It wasn't just banditry, it was organized plunder. Division of spoils. The rules for dividing loot were surprisingly detailed. Here is how it often worked. The leader took the biggest cut. Specialists like shipbuilders or skilled warriors sometimes got extra shares. Ordinary crewmen got a standard portion. Equipment captured, like weapons or armor, could be shared out or sold for silver. Slaves taken in raids were divided up or sold later. Even animals had rules. If you captured a cow during a raid, you couldn't just keep it for yourself. It had to be counted as part of the loot and shared. It's almost funny to imagine dozens of warriors arguing over who gets the goat, while piles of gold and silver sit in the corner. Markets abroad. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also welcomed in foreign markets. In Constantinople, for example, they were known as Varangians, and they had special laws allowing them to trade. But these laws also place limits. In some cities, Vikings could only trade in certain areas, and they had to follow local customs. Break the rules, and you risk losing access or worse, facing punishment in a foreign land. So even abroad, Vikings had to play by the rules. When raids went wrong, what happened if a raid went badly? Say, your crew lost half its men, and the survivors limped home empty-handed. The law still applied. Everyone who invested in the raid, whether with supplies, weapons, or manpower, had to share the losses as well as the gains. If you borrowed money to join a raid and came back broke, you were still expected to repay your debts. It was high risk, high reward. Raiding could make you rich, or it could leave you bankrupt and shamed. Honor and greed at the core of Viking trade and raiding laws was one big principle: fairness. Everyone wanted wealth, but nobody wanted to be cheated. A leader who took too much of the loot lost respect. A merchant who lied about his goods ruined his reputation. And in Viking society, reputation was worth more than silver. So even though Vikings are remembered for chaos and destruction, their laws kept things balanced. Without them, trade would collapse, raids would end in betrayal, and no one would trust anyone else. Wrapping up, trade and raiding were two sides of the same coin in Viking life. One was peaceful, the other violent, but both were governed by laws that kept people honest, honest enough for Vikings, anyway. They might have been fierce warriors, but they also knew the value of fairness. Whether selling a sword in a marketplace or dividing up a monastery's treasure, the rules mattered. Laws on property and land for all their adventuring, raiding, and trading. Vikings were also farmers at heart. Sure, sailing off to raid a monastery in England sounds exciting, but most of the time, your average Viking was back home tending crops, feeding animals, and fixing roofs. And what's the number one thing farmers care about? Land. Land wasn't just dirt to the Vikings, it was life. It was food, wealth, and status. Owning land meant independence. Losing land meant hardship. And because land was so important, Viking societies developed a whole web of laws to manage it. Some of these laws were surprisingly sophisticated, while others sound kind of weird today. But all of them show how deeply the Vikings cared about keeping order when it came to who owned what. The value of land in the Viking Age. Wealth wasn't just measured in silver or loot, it was measured in land. If you had a big farm, you had power. You could support more family members, host feasts, and command loyalty from neighbors. Land also tied people to their communities. Unlike silver, you couldn't just pack it up and sail away. That meant land ownership had to be protected by clear rules. Otherwise, every dispute would end with swords drawn, and society would collapse into endless fighting. Inheritance laws. One of the most important areas of Viking law was inheritance. Who got the farm when the owner died? In general, land passed to male heirs first, sons, then brothers, then other male relatives. But women weren't left out entirely. Daughters could inherit if there were no sons, and widows often held land until their sons were old enough to take over. This might sound fair enough, but things got complicated fast. Say a man had two sons, but one of them died, leaving behind children. Did the grandchildren get a share of the land, or did the surviving son keep it all? Questions like these kept the Viking legal system very busy. Joint ownership. Sometimes land was inherited by multiple siblings, which meant they had to share it. But farming with your brother-in-law breathing down your neck wasn't always smooth sailing. To handle this, Viking law allowed land to be divided or for one sibling to buy out the others. Still, disputes happened constantly. If the brothers disagreed on who got the good field and who got the swamp, they could take the issue to the thing. The assembly would hear arguments and settle the matter. Imagine standing up in front of your neighbors, arguing passionately that your brother should get the bog, because hay's always been better with mud. That's Viking justice for you. Boundaries and neighbors. Another huge issue was boundaries. Where did your land end and your neighbor's land begin? In a world without fences, GPS maps, or official deeds, this wasn't always clear. To avoid endless squabbles, Vikings used markers, stones, rivers, or even trees. That nature changes. Trees die, rivers move, stones get mysteriously rolled a few feet. If you accused your neighbor of moving a boundary, it was off to the thing again. There were also laws about trespassing. If your cows wandered onto your neighbor's land and ate his grass, you owed him compensation. And if you cut wood from someone else's forest without permission, you were stealing. Viking law was very clear. Respect your neighbor's property, or pay the price. Buying and selling land wasn't just inherited, it could also be bought and sold. But Viking law made sure this wasn't done lightly. For a sale to be valid, it had to be witnessed. Usually, the transaction took place at the thing, with several free men present to make it official. That way, nobody could later claim, "Oh, I never sold that farm. He's lying." Payment had to be fair, too. If someone tricked you into selling land too cheaply, you might have grounds to challenge the sale. In short, land sales were serious business, with the law keeping everything above board. Women and land. Here is where things get interesting. While Viking society was mostly male-dominated, women had more rights to property than in many other medieval cultures. A widow, for example, could manage her late husband's land until her children came of age. Women could also inherit land directly if there were no male heirs, and in some cases, women could even sell land on their own authority. This gave Viking women a surprising amount of independence. Owning land meant they could make decisions, enter contracts, and support their families without relying entirely on male relatives. Outlaws and land. If you were outlawed, banished from society, your land didn't just sit empty. It usually went to your relatives, or in some cases, to the person you wronged. This was part of the punishment. Losing your land meant losing your wealth and status, which was often worse than losing your life. You could run away, but without land, you had nothing to come back to. Disputes and violence, of course. Not everyone followed the rules. Land disputes could get violent, especially if people felt cheated. Feuds often started over who inherited a farm, or whether a boundary had been moved. That's why the law was so important. By giving people a way to settle disputes at the thing, society kept these conflicts from turning into endless cycles of revenge. It didn't always work, but it was better than constant bloodshed. Land and power. At the highest levels of Viking society, land meant political power. Chieftains controlled large estates and used their wealth to support followers. They gave land to loyal warriors in exchange for service, much like the feudal system that developed later in Europe. So while raiding and silver might get you fame, it was land that gave you lasting influence. A successful raider might come home rich, but unless he used that wealth to buy land, his power would fade. Wrapping up property and land laws might not sound as exciting as raiding monasteries or dueling in the forest, but for the Vikings, they were the backbone of society. Without clear rules about inheritance, boundaries, and sales, farming communities would collapse into chaos. And while Viking laws could be strict, they were also surprisingly practical, balancing tradition, fairness, and flexibility. At the end of the day, Vikings were just like us. They wanted to know exactly who owned what, and they definitely didn't want to lose an argument about who got stuck with the swamp. Laws on punishment and execution. So far, we've seen how Viking laws tried to keep society running smoothly. They had rules about theft, marriage, property, and even duels. But of course, laws don't mean much without consequences. If you broke the rules, you had to pay the price. And in the Viking world, that price could range from a fine to something much, much harsher. Viking punishments were designed to keep order, scare people into behaving, and most importantly avoid constant revenge killings. But make no mistake, these punishments could be brutal and sometimes a little creative. Let's take a look at how the Vikings handled crime and justice when things got ugly. Fines. The first line of punishment. Not every Viking crime ended in bloodshed. In fact, most punishments started with fines. If you stole something, damaged property, or insulted someone's honor, you usually had to pay compensation. This system was called wergild or man price. Basically, every person had a set value, depending on their rank in society. If you injured or killed someone, you owed their family a payment equal to their wergild. It was kind of like an early insurance system, except instead of paperwork, you had angry relatives waiting to see if you'd pay up. And if you didn't, well, things could get violent. Outlawry, worse than death. One of the harshest punishments in Viking law wasn't execution, it was outlawry. If you were declared an outlaw, you were basically erased from society. You lost all rights, all protection under the law, and anyone could kill you without consequences. Even your family was forbidden from helping you. There were two main kinds: lesser outlawry, which lasted 3 years. If you survived that long, you could come back. Full outlawry, which was permanent. You were gone for good. Imagine being cast out into the wilderness with no home, no community, and no protection. It was a living death, and most outlaws didn't last long. Corporal punishment for crimes that didn't deserve death or outlawry, but were still serious. There were physical punishments. These could include whipping, mutilation, or branding. For example, thieves might have their ears cut off as a permanent reminder of their crime. Not exactly the kind of scar story you'd want to brag about. These punishments weren't just about pain, they were about shame. Everyone who saw you would know what you'd done. In a small community, that was devastating. Execution, of course. Some crimes did end with death. Murder without proper compensation, treason, or especially dishonorable acts could all lead to execution. The Vikings didn't have one standard method of execution. Different communities had different traditions. Some hanged criminals, others beheaded them, and in extreme cases, more creative punishments were used. One of the most infamous, though debated by historians, was the blood eagle. According to sagas, this involved cutting open the victim's back and pulling out their lungs in the shape of wings. Was it real, or just a terrifying story? Hard to say, but either way, it tells us a lot about how the Vikings wanted to portray their punishments. Trial by ordeal sometimes. When evidence was thin, Vikings used ordeals to decide guilt or innocence. This could mean walking across hot coals, carrying a piece of red-hot iron, or plunging your hand into boiling water. If you healed cleanly afterward, you were innocent. If not, well, tough luck. From our perspective, this sounds completely unfair. But to the Vikings, it was a way of letting the gods decide the outcome. And in a society built on honor and faith, that carried real weight. Punishment for women. Viking women weren't exempt from punishment. If a woman committed theft, adultery, or other crimes, she could face fines, outlawry, or even execution. That said, women sometimes got lighter punishments for certain offenses, especially if men were involved in leading them astray. But don't be fooled, women could absolutely be held accountable, and sagas tell us about cases where they were punished just as harshly as men. Public shame. Another powerful punishment in Viking society was public humiliation. This might mean being mocked at the thing, shamed in front of your community, or losing honor in ways that hurt your reputation for life. Since honor was everything in Viking culture, being labeled a liar, coward, or thief could be worse than physical pain. You couldn't raid, trade, or marry well if no one trusted you. Mercy and forgiveness. Interestingly, not all punishments were harsh. Viking law also allowed for forgiveness and settlement. If you could make peace with the injured party through compensation or marriage alliances, sometimes harsher punishments could be avoided. This wasn't just kindness, it was practical. Keeping the peace was more important than revenge. And in small farming communities, you couldn't afford to have everyone at each other's throats. A harsh but practical system. Looking back, Viking punishments might seem cruel. Outlawry, mutilation, executions, ordeals, they all sound like something out of a nightmare. But in context, they were practical solutions. Viking society didn't have police, jails, or prisons. They relied on community enforcement, honor, and fear. Harsh punishments kept people in line and gave structure to a world that could easily descend into chaos. And for all their brutality, these laws worked. The Vikings managed to build stable societies that lasted for centuries, not just wild bands of raiders, but functioning communities with rules, farms, and families. Wrapping up, so there you have it, the punishments of Viking law. From fines to outlawry, from branding to executions, the Vikings had a whole toolbox of justice to keep their world in order. It wasn't always fair, and it definitely wasn't gentle, but it reflected their values, honor, order, and survival. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the strange laws of the Vikings. From duels to property rights, from marriage customs to brutal punishments, these laws paint a picture of a society that was complex, practical, and sometimes downright terrifying. The next time you think about Vikings, don't just picture them swinging axes or raiding monasteries. Picture them at the Thing, debating land boundaries, arguing over inheritance, and deciding whether someone should be outlawed. Because for all their fierceness, they were also people who valued rules and who knew that without laws, even the strongest warrior couldn't survive. So, sleep well tonight, knowing that if you lived in Viking times, at least you'd know the rules, even if breaking them could cost you everything.